In this context, the emergency landing was interpreted not only as an accident but as a test, a moment that forced governments to ask a difficult question. If sovereignty is absolute on land, why should it be ambiguous in the air? This is why the reaction was swift, and why the language was uncompromising. Officials linked to the Sahel alliance signaled that future unauthorized entries could be neutralized. The word itself carried weight, deliberately chosen, deliberately vague. It was not a threat spelled out in detail, it was a boundary drawn in principle. Observers noted that this tone marked a shift. In earlier years, such incidents might have been resolved quietly, behind closed doors, through military-to-military channels. This time the assertion was public, almost declarative. The sky, they were saying, is no longer a shared assumption. It is a line. Behind this stance lay more than one incident. Analysts have pointed to a broader pattern of heightened sensitivity around airspace across the Sahel region. Increased monitoring, expanded radar coverage where possible, sharper rules of engagement. Not because states seek escalation, but because they seek control. In regions where ground borders are porous, the air becomes the last clear boundary, and controlling that boundary is a way of reclaiming agency, of stating without ambiguity that sovereignty does not stop at the horizon. For ordinary citizens, the incident barely registered at first. No explosions, no dramatic footage, no immediate disruption to daily life. Yet symbolically, it mattered, because it suggested that the era of silent skies was ending. What had once been governed by habit was now being governed by intent. What had once been technical was becoming political. And for pilots, planners, and governments alike, the message was unmistakable. Every flight path now carries meaning. The emergency landing was resolved. The aircraft did not remain. Diplomacy continued. No confrontation followed that day. But something fundamental had shifted. The sky had spoken, not with noise, but with consequence. And as this single incident faded from headlines, a larger question loomed beneath it. If one unexpected landing could redraw the rules of the air, what would happen when the next aircraft crossed an invisible line? Because this moment was not an anomaly. It was a warning. The response did not unfold in the air. It unfolded in language. Statements hardened. Words were weighed. Phrases once reserved for border incursions began to appear in discussions about flight paths. What had started as an emergency landing was now being framed through a different lens, not aviation safety, but authority. Officials spoke carefully, yet firmly. This was not about pilots, not about mechanics, it was about precedent. Because if an unplanned entry could be excused today, what would stop routine overflights tomorrow? In diplomatic circles, the debate sharpened. Some voices emphasized coordination, pointing to long-standing practices of notification and cooperation. Others pushed back, arguing that these practices were remnants of an era when decisions about the sky were made elsewhere, with local consent assumed rather than asked for. This contrast defined the moment. On one side stood the language of systems, protocols, procedures, technical standards. On the other stood the language of sovereignty, dignity, control, red lines. They were not speaking the same dialect. For years, regional airspace management had relied on quiet understandings. Planes crossed borders daily with minimal friction. Control towers coordinated. Militaries communicated discreetly. The goal was efficiency, not symbolism. But symbolism had arrived anyway. Within the Sahel alliance, commentators framed the incident as a necessary line being drawn. According to accounts from the period, officials argued that ambiguity invited erosion. If boundaries were not asserted, they would be tested, and if they were tested without consequence, they would eventually be ignored. The word neutralization echoed through analyses, deliberately imprecise, yet unmistakably serious. It did not describe an action taken, it described a posture adopted. This was escalation by definition, not by deed. International observers noticed the shift immediately. Analysts described the region recalibrating its thresholds, not seeking confrontation, but refusing invisibility. Some characterized it as a response to years of intensified aerial activity. Surveillance platforms, reconnaissance flights, unmanned systems passing overhead with increasing frequency. The sky, once distant, had become intimate. From outside the region, reactions were cautious. Diplomatic language focused on stability, safety, and communication. No one rushed to endorse hard lines. No one dismissed them either. The tone was watchful, because beneath the immediate debate lay a deeper reordering. For decades, airspace governance in the region had been influenced by inherited frameworks, technical regimes shaped far beyond local capitals. They worked largely because no one challenged them openly, but they also left unanswered questions about agency. Who decides when a deviation is acceptable? Who judges intent? Who enforces consequence? The incident forced those questions into daylight. Within military circles, discussions reportedly turned to rules of engagement, not to provoke, but to clarify. When does monitoring become warning? When does warning become action? Where exactly is the line? These are not abstract questions when aircraft are involved. They are measured in seconds, in altitude, in radar returns. And they are moral questions as much as operational ones, because responding too softly risks signaling weakness. Responding too harshly risks catastrophe. The balance is unforgiving. Public opinion, though quieter, carried its own weight. Commentators and citizens alike began to speak about the sky in new terms, not as a shared convenience, but as an extension of national space. The idea resonated. Perhaps because borders on the ground had long felt compromised, the air offered a cleaner assertion. No checkpoints, no fences, just lines that must be respected. In this framing, asserting control over airspace became a stand-in for something larger. The right to set terms, to be consulted, to be acknowledged, not charity, not tolerance, recognition. Critics warned of risks. They spoke of miscalculation, of accidents turning into crises. They urged restraint, coordination, calm. Their concerns were valid, but restraint without authority, others countered, was merely silence. And silence, in the current climate, was no longer seen as neutral. As debates intensified, one reality became clear. The incident had accelerated the conversation that was already underway. The sky had become a canvas onto which deeper anxieties were projected, about influence, about security, about who shapes the future. The aircraft had landed. The crews had departed, but the argument remained. And while officials traded words and analysts traced implications, something else was happening quietly, almost unnoticed. The architecture of airspace itself was beginning to change. Routes, rules, systems. The battle was no longer just about who crossed the sky. It was about how the sky would be organized from here on. And that shift, technical on the surface, transformative beneath, would carry consequences far beyond politics. Because once power begins to rewrite the map of the air, the ground below is never untouched. The consequences did not arrive with sirens. They arrived quietly, in schedules, in costs, in hesitation. For civilian aviation, the shift was subtle at first. Routes were reviewed, clearances double-checked, pilots received updated briefings that lingered a little longer on political sensitivities rather than weather patterns. What had once been a matter of fuel efficiency now carried an additional question. Is this corridor still safe to use? Airlines began to adjust, not dramatically, not publicly, but deliberately. A slight detour here, an extra coordination call there. Minutes added to flight times, margins thinned. In an industry where precision defines profit, even small deviations matter. Each additional mile burns fuel. Each delay ripples through tightly choreographed networks. For passengers, this often went unnoticed. For operators, it did not. Behind the scenes, air traffic controllers faced a different pressure. Their role had always been technical: maintain separation, ensure safety, keep traffic flowing. But as airspace grew politicized, neutrality became harder to sustain. Every clearance carried weight. Every instruction could be scrutinized. Controllers were not choosing sides. They were navigating an environment where the sky itself had acquired intent. At the same time, governments across the region began to revisit long-discussed reforms in airspace management. The logic was straightforward. If the sky now mattered more, it had to work better. This is where the conversation turned technical. Plans for free route airspace gained momentum. Instead of forcing aircraft along rigid, decades-old corridors, the idea was to allow more flexible routing, letting planes choose the most efficient path between entry and exit points. On paper, the benefits were compelling. Shorter routes, lower fuel consumption, reduced emissions, significant savings for airlines operating on tight margins. But flexibility requires confidence. And confidence requires control. To manage freer routes, states need reliable surveillance, modern radar, and coordinated systems. In parts of the region, those capabilities remain uneven. Some airspaces are well monitored, others rely on procedural control and trust. Trust, however, is fragile when sovereignty is under discussion. As reforms progressed, a paradox emerged. The same technologies that promised efficiency also enabled greater monitoring, more data, more tracking, more awareness of who was flying where and why. For security planners, this was a gain. For civil aviation, it was a complication. Pilots began to speak cautiously about the psychological shift. Flying over contested skies had always carried risk, but the nature of that risk was changing. It was no longer only about turbulence or technical failure. It was about interpretation. How would a deviation be read? As an error or as intent? For passengers, the human cost surfaced in quieter ways. Delays, higher ticket prices, reduced connectivity to certain destinations. None of it dramatic enough to make headlines, yet cumulative in effect. Air travel is not a luxury for everyone. For many communities, it is a lifeline, linking markets, families, and opportunities. When routes become uncertain, isolation follows. This is where the broader picture came into focus. The reordering of the skies was not only about security, it was about economics, about who benefits from connectivity and who pays the price when it falters, about whether the promise of integration could survive rising caution. Across Africa, these questions carried particular weight. The continent's aviation sector has long been described as underconnected, fragmented, constrained by inherited systems that never fully served local needs. Reform was overdue. But reform under pressure looks different from reform by choice. Airspace redesign, once a technocratic exercise, became entangled with questions of dignity and control. Who designs the routes? Who owns the data? Who decides which skies are open and under what conditions? Even environmental considerations entered the debate. Efficient routing reduces emissions, but only if planes are allowed to fly freely. Detours burn fuel. Hesitation costs carbon. The sky, once a solution, risked becoming another bottleneck. Yet amid these challenges, some saw opportunity. If airspace was being reasserted as sovereign territory, then investment in its management could follow. Training, infrastructure, regional coordination on equal terms. A chance to build systems that reflect local priorities rather than inherited defaults. This optimism was cautious, grounded, aware of risk, because every gain carried a trade-off. More control could mean more friction. More monitoring could mean more misunderstanding. The line between safety and suspicion remained thin. Still, one thing was clear. The days of passive skies were over. Every route now told a story. Every clearance reflected a calculation. Every flight path traced not just geography, but politics. What had begun as an isolated incident was reshaping daily operations, economic logic, and human experience, quietly, persistently. And as airlines adapted and passengers adjusted, another reality was taking shape beyond the region. Because when the skies over one part of the world change, the world does not look away, it recalculates. And somewhere beyond these altered routes and tightened controls, a new set of eyes was already watching from afar. Beyond the region, the reaction was measured, careful, almost restrained. In foreign capitals, officials avoided dramatic language. Statements emphasized safety, coordination, stability. The familiar vocabulary of diplomacy returned, calm words, balanced phrases, and insistence on dialogue. But behind that calm, attention sharpened. Because airspace is never only local. For international organizations, the shift raised practical questions. How would new enforcement postures affect overflight agreements? What would tighter controls mean for humanitarian flights, for commercial routes, for multinational operations that rely on predictable corridors through the continent? No one rushed to answer publicly. Instead, observers watched. Regional bodies, including the African Union, framed the moment as part of a longer journey, one toward clearer ownership, stronger institutions, and rules defined closer to home. The language focused on coordination, not confrontation, on reform, not rupture. Yet the subtext was unmistakable. The era of assumed access was ending. From outside Africa, analysts began to speak of recalibration. Airspace over the Sahel had long been treated as a passageway, crossed by surveillance platforms, logistics aircraft, and international operations with limited scrutiny. That assumption was now under review, not revoked, reconsidered. In European discussions, the emphasis fell on continuity, on ensuring that civilian aviation remained insulated from political friction, on preventing miscalculation, on keeping channels open. In Washington, commentary centered on risk management, on avoiding incidents that could spiral, on understanding new red lines before testing them. No one described the shift as hostile. No one dismissed it either, because the pattern was familiar. Control over infrastructure often precedes control over narrative. When nations begin to assert authority over the systems that connect them to the world, ports, data, energy, and now airspace, it signals something deeper than regulation. It signals intent. For logistics planners and airlines operating intercontinental routes, the message was pragmatic. Plan ahead. Engage early. Assume that permissions once granted by default would now require clarity. For security analysts, the implications ran wider. A region willing to assert itself in the sky was a region redefining its place on the map, not just geographically, but politically. This did not mean isolation. It meant negotiation on different terms. The sky was becoming a venue of diplomacy in its own right. Every clearance, a conversation, every corridor, an agreement, every deviation, a test of understanding. And while global actors adjusted their language, one fact stood out. The initiative was no longer external. It was coming from within. From governments rethinking their thresholds, from institutions revisiting old frameworks, from a growing insistence that sovereignty must be visible, even when exercised above the clouds. International attention did not drive this shift, it responded to it. As discussions continued and policies adapted, the skies over the region took on a new significance, not as a barrier, but as a statement. The world was still flying overhead, but it was no longer doing so unquestioningly. And as foreign observers recalculated their routes and their assumptions, the most important decisions were being made closer to the ground by those who lived beneath these skies and who would now define their meaning, because global interest can adjust to new rules. The real question was whether those rules would lead to restraint or to something far less predictable. The future did not announce itself with certainty. It arrived as a choice. In the months that followed, policymakers across the region faced a delicate balance: to assert control without provoking escalation, to protect sovereignty without turning the sky into a trigger. Because airspace is unforgiving. On the ground, misunderstandings can be contained. In the air, seconds matter, altitude matters, interpretation matters. A misread signal, a delayed response, an assumption carried too far, any of these can turn routine movement into crisis. This is the risk. A sky defined only by suspicion invites confrontation. one where every deviation is treated as intent, every silence as defiance. In such an environment, restraint becomes harder, not easier. Yet the alternative is not retreat. For many in the region, reasserting control over the air is seen as long overdue, not as a rejection of cooperation, but as a demand for clarity, clear rules, clear permissions, clear consequences. Sovereignty, after all, is not exercised only when challenged. It is exercised through systems that function predictably. This is where opportunity emerges. By investing in airspace management, training controllers, modernizing surveillance, strengthening coordination, states can turn assertion into stability. Control does not have to mean confrontation. It can mean competence. And competence builds trust. A sky that is clearly governed reduces ambiguity. Pilots know what is expected. Airlines plan with confidence. Neighbors understand boundaries. Diplomacy moves from reaction to routine. There is also a broader horizon to consider. Across Africa, airspace has the potential to become a platform for integration rather than division. Efficient routing, shared standards, mutual respect for sovereign control, these are not contradictions. They are prerequisites. The challenge lies in sequencing. Authority must be established before flexibility can be offered. Respect must precede openness. Without that order, reform collapses under suspicion. In the Sahel, where borders on the ground remain fragile, the sky offers a chance to redraw the relationship between state and space, to demonstrate that control can be exercised without force and independence without isolation. This is not guaranteed. There will be incidents, there will be pressure, there will be moments when restraint is tested, but there will also be moments of learning, when procedures hold, when communication works, when a potential crisis dissolves into coordination. Those moments matter because they show that sovereignty is not a posture, it is a practice. The sky, once ignored, now demands attention, not as a battlefield, but as a responsibility. One that carries economic promise, environmental consequence, and symbolic weight. The choice ahead is not between openness and control, it is between clarity and chaos. If the skies are governed with intent and patience, they can become bridges rather than barriers. Lines that organize movement instead of dividing it. And if one region can redefine its relationship with the air above it, turning invisible space into visible agency, the implications reach far beyond flight paths. They touch on how nations stand, how they are recognized, and how the future is negotiated, because the sky may be invisible, but the decisions made within it are not. What began as a single flight drifting off course has revealed something far larger. Not a technical failure, not a misunderstanding, but a moment of reckoning. The skies over this continent are no longer silent corridors of convenience. They are spaces of meaning, of memory, of intention. When airspace becomes contested, it tells us that sovereignty itself is being renegotiated, not only on maps but in mindset. For decades, control was measured by what could be fenced, guarded, or occupied on land. Yet today, power increasingly moves above us, in satellites and sensors, in routes and permissions, in who watches and who decides. And this is why the story of Africa's skies matters. Because reclaiming authority in the air is not about closing doors. It is about opening conversations on equal terms. It is about replacing assumption with consent, silence with voice. In the Sahel, this shift carries particular weight. A region long defined by fragility is now asserting clarity, not recklessly, not noisily, but deliberately, by stating that even what cannot be seen must still be respected. There is pain in this transition, there is risk, missteps will happen, tensions will surface. Yet there is also possibility, the kind that emerges only when old habits are questioned and new standards are written. If airspace can be governed with competence rather than fear, it can become a bridge instead of a fault line. A system that supports trade over dependence, coordination over suspicion, dignity over invisibility. This is not a rejection of the world. It is an invitation to engage differently. Because when one region insists on being seen, even above the clouds, it sends a message far beyond flight paths. It reminds us that sovereignty is not static. It is practiced, protected, renewed. And if the skies above Africa can shift from shadow into light, from assumption into agency, then this story is not only about aviation, it is about the future. If this moment made you pause, stay with the journey. These skies are still being written, and the next chapter will matter. A routine flight drifted a little too far. No warning shots, no sirens, just a line on a map crossed, and suddenly the sky itself became a problem. In the thin air above West Africa, what looked like a navigational mistake triggered something far deeper. Not fear of a crash, not concern for passengers, but a question of who truly owns the space above a nation's head. For decades, the sky was treated as neutral, invisible, technical, apolitical, but today that illusion is breaking apart. Because airspace is not empty, it is watched, it is guarded, it is claimed. And when a plane enters it uninvited, the response is no longer silence. Across the region, warnings are sharper, surveillance is tighter, statements are firmer. The message is unmistakable. The sky is territory now. This is not just about aviation rules, it is about power without borders, sovereignty without fences, law written not on land, but in air. And if control of the ground once decided the fate of nations, what happens when control of the sky becomes the new front line? Stay with us, because this story is not about a flight. It is about who owns the sky. The incident did not begin with a warning, it began with routine. A military aircraft was in the air following a planned route, carrying personnel across West Africa. According to accounts that emerged later, a technical problem developed mid-flight. Instruments faltered, decisions had to be made quickly. And then, quietly, the aircraft crossed into airspace it was not scheduled to enter. What followed was not chaos in the cockpit. It was tension on the ground. In a reconstructed account described by regional officials, the aircraft made an emergency landing at an airfield in Burkina Faso. No shots were fired, no alarms rang across cities. The crew was secured. The situation was contained, but politically, nothing about this moment was small. Within hours, statements began to surface. Burkina Faso's authorities framed the landing not merely as an aviation matter, but as a violation of sovereign airspace. In parallel, voices linked to the alliance of Sahel states spoke in unusually firm terms, warning that future incursions into their skies would not be treated lightly. This was the turning point, because emergency landings happen, mechanical failures happen, weather shifts, instruments fail, pilots improvise. Yet this time, the response moved beyond technical explanation and into the language of territory, control, and authority. In public briefings and diplomatic exchanges, the message was clear. Airspace was no longer to be treated as a flexible corridor of convenience. It was to be respected as national ground, invisible, but no less real. From the Nigerian side, officials emphasized safety. They described the landing as necessary, unplanned, and handled professionally. They noted that the crew was treated well and that the situation posed no threat. Both narratives could coexist, and that was precisely the problem. Because between emergency and violation lay a fault line that could not be ignored. For decades, much of Africa's airspace had been governed quietly. Boundaries existed on charts, enforced through coordination rather than confrontation. Flights passed overhead, radar screens blinked, control towers spoke in calm, standardized phrases. The sky was functional, and function was mistaken for neutrality. But neutrality is a fragile illusion. In the Sahel, where borders on the ground are contested by insecurity, insurgency, and foreign interest, the sky has begun to matter differently. Surveillance aircraft, military overflights, drones, intelligence platforms, each one has reshaped how airspace is perceived, not as empty space, but as strategic depth.